The mud of the main street was a thick, greedy thing, sucking at the boots of the few souls dour enough to be out in the clinging gray damp of the afternoon. Spring had come to the territory not as a promise, but as a threat, melting the snow into a cold slurry that seeped into everything, chilling bone and spirit alike. Buildings leaned against the bruised sky, their unpainted faces streaked with the memory of a hard winter. It was a place where hope came to die quietly. Into this tableau of weary resignation walked Abel. He was a man built of the mountain he called home, broad in the shoulder and deep in the chest, with a wild tangle of dark hair and a beard that fell over the worn leather of his jerkin. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of immense strength held in careful reserve, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, taking in the town's familiar misery with a practiced detachment. He came down from his solitude only when necessity demanded it, for salt and flour and the brief, jarring reminder of what he had left behind. And then he saw her. She was a slash of vibrant color in a world of brown and gray, a crimson dress clinging to a slight frame. Her hands were bound with coarse rope to the town's hitching post, the one usually reserved for horses or drunks. She was Chinese, a rarity in these parts, and her face was a mask of stoic endurance, though her dark eyes scanned the faces of the onlookers with a desperate, searching light. Abel felt a familiar tug, the instinct to turn away, to retreat back into the clean, uncomplicated silence of the high peaks. The affairs of men were messy, cruel, and of no concern to him. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for anyone else's. He was about to turn toward the mercantile when her eyes found his, and in that instant the world narrowed to the space between them. Her gaze held him, not with accusation, but with a raw, terrifying plea. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but it cut through the damp air with the clarity of a shattered icicle. "Marry me." The words were for him alone, a missile aimed at the fortress of his solitude. The townsfolk shifted, their murmurs a low rustle of dry leaves. She pulled uselessly at her bonds, her chin lifting with a defiant pride that warred with the desperation in her voice. "I'll be yours forever." The murmurs of the townsfolk swelled into a low, scornful tide, a sound of derision that was as much a part of the town as the mud in its streets. A few men laughed outright, a harsh, barking sound that held no humor. Abel didn't move, his gaze locked on the woman tied to the post. Forever. It was a word he hadn't heard or considered in a decade, a word that belonged to a different man, a different life. It sounded foreign and impossible in the cold air. The town marshal, a portly man named Croft with a face like a slab of uncooked dough, pushed through the small crowd. He hitched his gun belt and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Abel's feet, an act of casual disrespect. "That one's a thief, Abel," Croft said, his voice loud for the benefit of his audience. "Caught her taking a loaf of bread from Miller's. Got a day at the post to think on her sins." He smirked, looking the woman up and down. "Seems she's trying to trade one punishment for another." The laughter rippled again, crueler this time. Abel's silence was a heavy, physical thing. He could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted him to join in the joke, to scoff at the absurd proposal from the foreign girl in the red dress. They wanted him to affirm their judgment, to be one of them, the mountain recluse briefly returned to the fold to share in their petty cruelties. But Abel wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the raw knuckles where her wrists were bound, the dark smudge of dirt on her cheek, and the unyielding fire in her eyes. There was no shame there, only a ferocious will to survive. She was like a cornered wolf, ready to do anything, promise anything, to escape the trap. He understood that language better than he understood the jeers of the men around him. Croft nudged him with an elbow. "Go on, tell her what you think of her offer. Put the fear of God in her." Still, Abel said nothing. He simply watched her, and she watched him back, her entire future hanging in the balance of his stillness. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, the entire town holding its breath to see what the mountain man would do. Abel's mind was a silent battlefield. A part of him, the sensible, guarded part that had kept him alive and alone for so many years, screamed at him to turn and walk away, to go to the mercantile, get his salt, and disappear back into the pines, where the only voice he had to answer to was the wind's. This was not his fight. This woman was a stranger, her problems as foreign to him as the silk of her dress. Taking her in would be an act of madness. It would mean complications, noise, another presence in the crushing silence he had so carefully curated. His cabin was a sanctuary of solitude, a place where the past could be kept at bay by the simple, repetitive tasks of survival. Her presence would shatter that peace, inviting the world and its troubles across his threshold. He thought of the long, empty nights, the fire burning down to embers with no one to see it but him. He thought of the sound of his own breathing as the only proof he was still alive. For years that loneliness had been a shield, a thick hide he'd grown to protect a wound that never fully healed. It was a miserable comfort, but it was a comfort he understood. He knew its shape, its weight, its bitter taste. What she offered was the unknown, vulnerability, a connection that could bind him in ways far more permanent than the ropes on her wrists. The townspeople's expectant faces blurred at the edge of his vision. Their judgment was a tangible thing, a pressure against his skin. They saw a spectacle, a bit of grim entertainment to break the monotony of a damp afternoon. They did not see the desperation of a starving woman or the profound weariness in a lonely man's soul. He looked at her again. He saw the tremor in her hands, the slight, almost imperceptible quiver of her lip that betrayed the iron control of her expression. She was not just a thief, she was a survivor. And in her desperate plea, he heard an echo of his own unspoken yearning, a cry against the vast, indifferent emptiness that had consumed his life. To walk away would be to reaffirm that emptiness, to surrender to it completely. To accept would be to gamble what little peace he had on the slimmest chance of finding something more. With a slowness that seemed to draw all sound from the street, Abel reached for the hilt of the large hunting knife sheathed at his belt. The crowd drew a collective, sharp breath. Croft's hand instinctively went to his own sidearm, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. But Abel's movements were not threatening. They were deliberate, final. He ignored the marshal, his gaze fixed on the woman. He pulled the heavy blade free, its polished steel gleaming dully in the gray light. He took a step forward, the mud squelching under his heavy boots. He stopped in front of Miller, the baker, a thin man wringing his hands at the edge of the crowd. Abel's voice, when it came, was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "How much for the bread she took?" Miller stammered, taken aback. 5 cents, Abel." Without looking away from the baker, Abel reached into a small pouch on his belt and tossed a silver dime into the mud at the man's feet. "That's for the bread, and for your trouble." He then turned his back on the crowd and walked the final few feet to the post. He raised the knife, and with 2 swift, clean cuts, severed the ropes binding the woman's wrists. The fibers parted with a soft hiss, and her hands fell limply to her sides. She stumbled forward, saved from falling only by the post itself. She looked down at her freed hands, then up at the giant of a man who stood over her. His face was unreadable, a landscape of beard and hard lines carved by weather and solitude. He sheathed his knife and looked down at her, the height difference between them immense. The entire town was watching, silent and stunned. "You said forever," Abel said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion she could decipher. "That's a long time." She met his gaze, her own dark eyes reflecting the overcast sky. She did not look away. She simply nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head. It was a vow, a contract sealed in a moment of public shame and private desperation. He extended a large, calloused hand. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her small, trembling one in his. He curled his fingers around hers and gently pulled her upright, away from the post of her humiliation. His touch was firm, steady, and in that simple contact she was no longer a public spectacle. She was his. The journey away from the town was a silent one. Abel led the way, his long strides eating up the muddy track that wound its way from the settlement into the foothills. He did not look back to see the stunned faces of the townspeople, nor did he look at the woman trailing in his wake. He simply walked, his focus on the familiar path that would take him back to his world of stone and pine. Maylin followed, her thin-soled slippers ill-suited for the sucking mud and sharp rocks. The crimson silk of her dress was soon spattered and torn at the hem, a flag of surrender to the wilderness. She struggled to keep pace with his relentless stride, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold air burning her lungs. For the first mile he seemed oblivious to her struggle, a man lost in his own thoughts. But then, without turning, his pace slowed just enough for her to catch her breath, a small, unspoken concession. The higher they climbed, the more the world of men fell away, replaced by the hushed cathedral of the forest. The air grew cleaner, sharper, scented with damp earth and pine needles. The only sounds were the squelch of their footsteps and the mournful sigh of the wind through the high branches. After what felt like an eternity, the trees parted to reveal a small cabin tucked into a granite bluff. It was a simple, sturdy structure, built of heavy logs chinked with mud, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the vast, lonely wilderness that surrounded it. Abel pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, leaving her to follow. The interior was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, the clean, sharp scent of solitude itself. It was a single room, meticulously tidy but stark. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bedroll lay in a corner, and a rough-hewn table with a single chair stood in the center. It was a space built for one person, its every detail screaming of a life lived in absolute isolation. He gestured towards the fire. "Warm yourself." Then he turned away, busying himself with stoking the embers, adding a fresh log. The silence in the cabin was heavier, more profound than the silence on the trail. It was an active presence, filled with the thousand things they were not saying. He gave her a thick wool blanket from a wooden chest. "You can sleep there," he said, nodding toward the floor on the opposite side of the hearth. The fire was the only thing between them, a flickering barrier in the vast, uncertain space of their new life. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting gray light outside the cabin's single window. A silent routine began to weave itself around them. Abel would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient as he prepared for the day's hunt or trapping. He would leave without a word and return in the evening, often with game slung over his shoulder, his face etched with the cold and the silence of the mountains. Maylin, in turn, learned the rhythms of the small cabin. She swept the rough plank floor with a handmade broom, kept the fire fed, and attempted to cook with the limited provisions he had. Her first attempts at making bread with his coarse flour were dense, heavy failures, but she persisted, her quiet determination a force of its own. They moved around each other like ghosts, their lives overlapping in the small space, but never truly touching. The silence remained their constant companion, a third presence at their meager meals. But slowly, imperceptibly, cracks began to appear in the wall of quiet. One afternoon, while mending a tear in one of his heavy shirts with thread she had painstakingly unraveled from the hem of her own ruined dress, he returned early. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her small, nimble fingers work the needle. He said nothing, but he left a handful of dried berries on the table before retreating outside to chop wood. It was not a gift, but an offering. A few nights later, as the fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, she began to hum. It was a soft, mournful melody that seemed to hold all the sorrow of a distant land and a lost life. Abel, who was sharpening his knife by the hearth, stilled his hands. The sound was alien in the profound quiet he had cultivated for so long, yet it was not an intrusion. It was like water seeping into dry ground, filling a space he hadn't even realized was empty. He listened until the last note faded into the crackle of the fire. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, breaking the spell. "What is your name?" She looked up, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Maylin." He held her gaze for a beat longer than he ever had before. "Abel," he said. The exchange of names was a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their silence, a first tentative step towards something other than a grim arrangement for survival. The gloomy spring, which had lingered like an unwanted guest, finally unleashed its parting fury. The temperature plummeted, and what began as a cold rain turned to sleet, then to a thick, driving snow. A late blizzard descended from the high peaks, a white monster that swallowed the world and imprisoned them in the cabin. The wind shrieked around the eaves, a relentless, keening sound that worked its way through the chinks in the logs and into their bones. For 2 days they were trapped, the world outside a churning vortex of white. On the 3rd day, the wind died down, but the cold deepened, and Abel awoke with a fire in his chest and ice in his limbs. A fever took hold of him, a vicious, consuming heat that left him shivering violently beneath a pile of furs. He, who had always been a pillar of unassailable strength, was reduced to a weak, delirious man, his muttered words a nonsensical tangle of past and present. The balance of their strange household was shattered. Maylin, who had seemed so small and fragile against the backdrop of his raw-boned world, became his anchor in the storm of his illness. The fear she must have felt, alone in a hostile wilderness with the one person who offered her protection now helpless, was something she locked away. She moved with a purpose that belied her slight frame. She kept the fire roaring, rationing the dwindling supply of firewood with a miser's care. She melted snow in a pot over the flames, forcing him to drink the lukewarm water when his lips cracked and his throat was too raw to swallow. When his shivering became uncontrollable, she tore a long strip from the sleeve of her crimson dress, dipped it in the snow melt, and laid the cool, damp silk across his burning forehead. Through the long nights, she sat by his side, speaking to him in a low, soothing murmur. She told him stories in her own tongue, the soft, melodic cadence of the language a strange and beautiful music in the silent cabin. He understood none of the words, but in his delirium her voice was a lifeline, the only steady thing in a world that had dissolved into fever dreams and pain. He was a mountain of a man, but it was her small, persistent strength that kept the spark of his life from being extinguished by the crushing cold. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world of pristine, deathly white. The sun, when it returned, was a weak, pale disk in a washed-out sky. Inside the cabin, the crisis had passed. Abel's fever was gone, leaving him weak and hollowed out, but alive. He lay on his bedroll, watching Maylin as she moved about the small room. He saw her not as a burden or a stranger, but as the reason he was still breathing. Their supplies were nearly gone. The salted meat was down to its last few strips, the flour sack was depressingly light, and the firewood was a pitifully small pile in the corner. A trip to town was not a choice, it was a necessity. The journey down the mountain was slow and arduous. The deep snowdrifts made every step a struggle. Abel, still weak, leaned heavily on a walking staff he had fashioned, and more than once Maylin had to steady him, her small frame a surprising buttress against his weight. When they finally emerged from the tree line and saw the town below, it was as if they were returning from a different world. They walked down the main street together, and the effect was immediate. People stopped and stared. The whispers followed them like a wake. But the tone had changed. The scorn and mockery were gone, replaced by a grudging, astonished curiosity. They saw Abel, gaunt and pale beneath his beard, a shadow of the formidable man who had left weeks ago. And they saw the Chinese girl, no longer in her conspicuous red dress, but wrapped in one of Abel's old blankets, her face thin, but her expression resolute. She was not walking behind him, but beside him. They were a unit, bound together by a hardship the townspeople could only guess at. At the Mercantile, Croft the marshal stood on the porch, watching their approach. He looked from Abel's weakened state to Mei Lin's steady presence at his side, and for the first time a flicker of something like respect crossed his features. He didn't speak, but he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgment. Inside, Abel bought flour, salt, and beans. Then he paused, and in a move that silenced the store's other occupants, he bought a bolt of thick gray wool fabric and a spool of dark thread. He placed it on the counter without a word, a public declaration more powerful than any speech. He was providing for her. She was his to protect. Back in the cabin, the warmth of a newly fed fire pushed back the lingering chill of their journey. The space felt different now, charged with a new and unfamiliar intimacy. The wool fabric Abel had bought lay on the table, a bolt of unspoken promise. The grueling trip, the shared struggle against the blizzard, and the silent acknowledgment from the town had stripped away the last vestiges of their arrangement's transactional nature. What was left was something quieter, deeper, and far more terrifyingly real. They ate their meal of beans and freshly baked bread in a comfortable silence that bore no resemblance to the strained quiet of their first weeks together. The air was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but filled with a shared history, brief though it was. Later, as Mei Lin sat by the hearth, examining the new fabric, Abel watched her from his seat across the fire. The flickering light softened the hard lines of his face and caught the deep, thoughtful expression in her eyes. He thought of the long days of his fever, the hazy memories of her cool hand on his forehead, the constant, gentle murmur of her voice pulling him back from the edge. She had fought for his life with a quiet ferocity he had never witnessed. "You didn't have to stay," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his throat. His voice was a rasp, still raw from his sickness. She stopped running her hand over the wool and looked up, her gaze meeting his across the flames. Her eyes were dark and steady, holding a depth of understanding that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't for years. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "But you cut my ropes. No one else would have done that." He shook his head, a slight dismissive gesture. "That was just a moment. In the storm, when I was sick, you could have left, taken what you needed and gone. No one would have blamed you." Her expression didn't change. She held his gaze, her own unwavering. "I said forever," she whispered, the words hanging in the warm air between them. "Forever is through the storm." The simple finality of her statement struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not a promise born of desperation anymore, but a declaration of fact. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he reached across the small space that separated them. He laid his large, scarred hand over hers where it rested on the wool. Her fingers were small and fine-boned beneath his, but they did not flinch. They lay still, accepting his touch. In that quiet, profound contact, the fortress he had built around his heart for a decade finally crumbled to dust. The last of the snow melted away, and the mountainside erupted in a riot of green. The grim, reluctant spring had finally surrendered to the earnest warmth of summer. The air, which had been sharp with cold, was now soft and filled with the scent of damp earth, new leaves, and the distant perfume of wildflowers. Life, tenacious and vibrant, returned to the high country, and inside the cabin a similar transformation had taken place. The Spartan shelter that had been a refuge for Abel's loneliness was now, unequivocally, a home. The rhythms of their life were quiet and domestic, a gentle cadence of shared tasks and comfortable silences. Abel would spend his days checking his trap lines or fishing in the cold mountain streams, but he no longer moved with the solitary focus of a man alone. His thoughts were often of the cabin, of the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a beacon guiding him back. Maylin had brought a subtle order and warmth to the space. His single chair was now joined by a stool he had fashioned for her. The gray wool fabric had been transformed into a simple, practical dress that she wore with a quiet dignity. The smell of baking bread was often in the air, a scent so deeply tied to the idea of home that it sometimes made Abel's chest ache with a feeling he couldn't name. One bright afternoon, he sat on the cabin's small porch, repairing the handle of an axe, the rhythmic scrape of his file a peaceful sound in the quiet air. He could hear Maylin inside, humming the same soft, haunting melody she had hummed on one of their first nights together. But the tune was no longer mournful. It was now imbued with a gentle contentment. He paused in his work, listening. He had spent years believing that what he wanted was silence, an absence of the world. He had been wrong. What he had craved was not silence, but peace. Maylin emerged from the cabin, wiping her flour-dusted hands on an apron she had made from a spare piece of canvas. She came and stood beside him, looking out at the vast expanse of forested valleys below them. The view that had once been a symbol of his isolation was now something they shared. "The world is very big from here," she said quietly. He stopped his filing and looked up at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair. "It's big enough," he replied, his voice soft. She looked down at him and smiled. It was not the guarded, uncertain expression of her first weeks there, but a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. It was a smile of belonging. He returned it, a slow spreading of warmth across his own weathered face. The great, lonely mountain man and the desperate girl in the red dress were gone. In their place were just Abel and Maylin. And in the quiet peace of their shared world, forever had already begun.